Hello again, amazing teachers, and welcome to Module 2. In this module, we're going to be talking about the different types of learning centers. There's really two main types of learning centers that I want to talk to you about today. The first is exploration centers, and the second is skill centers. We're going to go in depth into each one of those, but then at the end, I'm going to show you a little exception to only having those two types, so stay tuned for that. The first type is exploration centers, and this is exactly what it sounds like. Your students are exploring materials. These centers are very open-ended. They have a variety of materials provided in them, and there's really no right or wrong outcome or project. Now, these exploration centers can be tied to academic standards. Absolutely, they can be tied to academic standards. However, most of the time, exploration centers are more so going to be tied to the standards that address language, communication, and social skills. So if you're a pre-K teacher, there are entire domains in your pre-K guidelines for language and communication and for social and emotional development. So those are the ones that you want to look at to see which ones you really want to focus on for these exploration centers. If you're in kinder first or second, the point 1 set of standards under language arts applies to these skills. K.1, 1.1, and 2.1 have 4 to 5 standards within them that address listening, speaking and communication, cooperating with other people, those kind of language and social goals. And so those are the ones you might want to look at to see how you can really address those skills in your exploration centers. Now, some examples of exploration centers that are open-ended with lots of materials might be an art center, where your students can choose to paint or to use clay or to use colored pencils to create whatever it is that they want to create. It might be a block center where you have wooden blocks or Legos or both, maybe toy cars to go with it, where they just get to be creative and they get to build and explore that construction aspect of the block center. Might be your reading center or your class library where you have lots of different reading materials and they get to go spend time there and read and retell and use props and use puppets as they're engaging with books. Might be a dramatic play center where they're getting to dress up and act out different roles with their friends. Or it might be a fine motor center where you have all kinds of materials provided and the whole goal is to build the fine motor skills in their hands to help them as they get older with cutting and writing and those kind of things. Now, let's talk about skill centers. Skill centers are way more specific. They are most of the time going to be tied to academic standards rather than the language, communication, and social standards. Although, if I'm being honest, every center should have some aspect of language, communication, and social skills, so you can always attach those to your centers. They just might not necessarily be the goal of the center, if that makes sense. So with a skill center, typically the goal is going to be academic skills. You're going to target skills that you've recently taught, or you're going to target skills that are ongoing that your students need constant practice with. You're going to give them a variety of ways to practice those skills, again, in ways that are engaging, hands-on, active. Some examples might be a fact fluency center. If you're a math teacher and you need your students to practice their addition facts or their subtraction facts, a fact fluency center is a great way to do that. And you can specifically target the facts that you want them to practice based on what you put in the center. You can give them multiple ways to practice so that they stay engaged and they keep working and working and working on building fluency with those skills. A sight word center is another example. If you're an ELAR teacher, students need to know sight words, and so giving them lots of different ways to practice the sight words that you've taught, or if they know all the ones that you've taught and you want them practicing new ones, you could include that as well. Maybe a retelling center where you give them a story and that you've covered, you put the book in the center and you give them props and they're practicing retelling and the different things that need to be included in an effective retell. Or it could be a math game center. If you want them to practice their fractions, if you want them to practice place value, you might have a game center where there's a whole variety of games that they can play, but they're all targeting that same set of skills in a little bit of a different way so that they stay engaged and they stay active while they're learning. Now, I told you before that there was an exception to just having two types of centers. You can have exploration centers and you can have skill centers. Some centers can be both. And this is actually where I would typically fall whenever I put centers in my classroom. Some examples of that might be the writing center. If the writing center is purely exploration, you might have all different kinds of paper, different sizes, different colors, different textures. You might have different writing utensils. So maybe they have regular pencils, maybe they have colored pencils, markers, crayons, pens, maybe even a typewriter if you want to go really old school, all different materials for writing. They might have word cards that go along with what you've been learning. So whenever they're writing their stories, they can find those words and add them and know how to spell it. But it could also be a skill center. If you're wanting them to specifically work on writing a friendly letter, you might put that task in there. So that's what they do when they go to the writing center. Maybe you're working on persuasive writing, and so you give them a prompt in the writing center that allows them to practice what you've taught them about writing persuasive pieces. Or you could combine those, and it could be both. You could have all the variety of materials. They can create their own stories, they can write little books, they can write poetry, they can choose what they write, but there might also be some directed activities in there as well. And they can choose if they want to answer that prompt, if they want to do a persuasive piece. Here's how you do it. Here's the steps that you need. Here's the directions that you need. So you can combine exploration centers and skill centers into the same thing. A math center is another great example of a center that can be both exploration and skill focused. You can have math manipulatives that they can explore and they can play with. You might put activity cards in with those manipulatives, so if they want to be a little bit more directed in their exploration, you're giving them some tools to do that. And you might also put actual skill practice in that center. So maybe the games that they're playing focus on certain skills. Maybe the task cards that you put in with the manipulatives focus on certain skills. So if they need to still explore the materials, they're able to, but if they are ready for that more directed skill practice, then you have that available to them as well. So there's lots of ways that you can utilize exploration centers and skill centers, and it doesn't have to stay the same all year. It might start off as an exploration center. In fact, I highly recommend that all of your centers start off that way so they can get playing with the materials out of their system. You know they're going to do that whenever you put the materials in front of them. So start it off as an exploration and then transition it into a skill center as you go through the year, or as you introduce things that they need to practice or that they need to work with more. Now, here's what I want you to hear clearly though. The goals that you have for your students during centers will determine the type of centers that you need to use and not the other way around. Let me say that again. The goals that you have for your students are going to determine the type of centers and the activities that you need to use instead of the other way around, right? We're not going to find some really cute center activity on TPT and think, oh, well, if I put this in the center, then I can have them work on this skill. It should be the other way around. Standards should always drive what you do in centers. Remember, that was factor number one, that centers should all have in common. So you're going to start with the standards, and that should determine if it's an exploration center, if it's a skill center, if it starts as exploration and gravitates to a skill center, or if it has a combination of both. So just make sure that you keep that in mind. Try to plan a combination of exploration and skill centers in your classroom. Make it a balance whenever you're choosing what centers you want to do. And again, make sure it always ties to those standards.